in the pursuit of truth and common sense in an unbelievable world. You're listening to the Right Mind podcast with your host, Todd Schowalter.
Hello, everybody. I'm Todd Schowalter, and welcome to Right Mind. As promised, with me back after the midterms is my favorite political analyst, Rich Rubino. How you doing, Rich?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me on again.
Well, you know what? When we last spoke, you promised to be back on after the midterms, but technically, we're not really over the midterms because today is Friday, and they're still counting votes. What's going on with that?
Well, some states are, shall we say, some elections are very close, and it could be a couple of weeks for some of these races. In Colorado, for example, with Lori Bobart's district. In the United States Senate, there's still a few votes that are outstanding. In the state of Nevada, for example, that for the state of Nevada and certainly the state of Georgia, there's likely to be a runoff, meaning on December 6th. See, under Georgia law, it's the only state in the country that requires this. You have to win an outright majority of the votes for a United States Senate race in order to be elected senator. So there's a libertarian named Chase Oliver in that race. He garnered about less than 2% of the vote, but it was enough to make it so that Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock will go on to a runoff.
Right, Arizona, and that kind of, I don't mean to jump in here, but that's the last thing that we spoke about on our last show is about the, the third party that just seems to be the spoiler and mess everything up. Is that what we have here again, basically?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing that happened last time around. There was a third-party candidate, and that means that if you have more than two candidates in a race, essentially, it's going to go to a runoff. So that's essentially what is happening in this race. Okay.
Now, the other big one that's kind of concerning or interesting, I should say, is out in Arizona. We got Carrie Lake. For a while there, everybody was down if you're a Carrie Lake supporter because it looked like she wasn't going to win. And now it looks like she's back and it's up and down. So where's that all stand? And why is it taking so long? Or why typically does it always take Arizona so long to get their act together?
Because of the way, essentially, that they count the ballots, getting stuff from drop boxes, that type of thing. But Arizona is not only the gubernatorial election, but also the United States Senate election. And that's the incumbent Mark Kelly.
Right.
He essentially, last time around, if you remember, he was elected to John McCain's seat because the unexpired term. So now he's running for the remainder of John McCain's seat. So he's up for essentially re-election. That has not been completely decided yet. It looks, though, like he's probably going to defeat Blake Masters. And if the Democrats can win 2 seats, if they can win Nevada and some of the votes are coming in from Clark County, for example, which is a Democratic area, and they can win the state of Arizona, then Georgia is just kind of icing on the cake, if you will, because essentially they would have the outright majority, and then that would be actually a pickup of a seat. There would actually be a pickup of a seat if they were to win the state of Georgia as well. If they were to lose one of those two, then essentially ground zero for the next month or so is going to be in Georgia, just like last time around when we had those 2 races. That's essentially the scenario right now.
Sure. I mean, that's basically, and again, it's like Arizona, some things you can just count on. So today is Friday.
It is.
Everything started on Tuesday, so we're a bit of the way out. Where, just for those everybody tuning in or has been asleep, I should say, where's everything stand right now? Because it's been up and down. We were expecting this red wave that didn't happen. I got a few thoughts on that as well. But right now, where are we at? I mean, are we pretty much tied?
I wouldn't say tied. Basically, the Democrats, there's a theoretically possible scenario where they could actually win the House, but everything would have to go right for them in terms of the 34 congressional districts that have yet to be decided. These are essentially marginal districts. They're still deciding them. Most of them are within 1 percentage point. It's interesting, though, some of the seats the Democrats won this time around, I think Republicans, when they would nominate mega-type candidates, I think they're really going to have to do some sort of a soul searching because they've nominated mega-type candidates in some of these districts and some of these states. And in some case, they perhaps would have won with a more establishment-oriented Republican, but sometimes the Republicans were a little bit out of the mainstream of their congressional district. And that may have been the problem in terms of why this is competitive. Because remember, Joe Biden has a job approval rating at about 40% right now. Yeah, generally speaking, when you have a president whose job approval is right around that scenario, you should be losing about 45 to 50 seats. Bill Clinton had a job approval about 45%. His party lost 53 seats and lost the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years. Ronald Reagan was right around that point. His party lost 26 seats. Barack Obama lost 63 seats in his first midterm election. So that shows you that there are a few variables that are divergent this time from previous elections. And basically, I think that those variables are certainly the Dobbs v. Jackson decision overturning Roe v. Wade, but also the fact that as much as Joe Biden is underwater right now, Donald Trump is also underwater. And every time you hear about Joe Biden, you also hear about Donald Trump in the news, and that is something that has, I think, brought so many Republicans down. And also the fact that some Donald Trump endorsed candidates in the primary landed up being able to win the primary because of Donald Trump's support, but they could not appeal to a broad cross section of constituencies beyond their own base in the general election.
Yeah, and he was pretty upset about that, obviously, Trump, that is. And one of the concerns, rather, that I've heard about is that a few of the, especially, Herschel Walker and that area, as far as Georgia, some of them wish maybe, he'd just butt out, because wasn't that a factor in why a lot of people think that Georgia lost last time, when he kind of stuck his nose in and kind of muddied up the waters?
Yeah, I think there are many Republicans, and you don't hear this necessarily because these are more establishment Republicans, and they don't want to go against Donald Trump publicly because Donald Trump is more popular with their own constituencies than they are. But I think what they're basically saying behind the scenes is, yes, when Donald Trump said essentially that the election was stolen from him, that depressed turnout in terms of Republicans in the two Georgia Senate races. And those two Georgia Senate races last time is what essentially gave hegemony of the part of the Democrats in terms of the United States Senate, where they have it now, where it's 50-50 with Vice President Harris breaking the tie. But there really is, I think, there's going to be kind of an autopsy in the Republican Party, which essentially says, on the one hand, you do want Donald Trump to be the nominee in 2024. Do you think he's going to bring as much as he can galvanize the base? And he certainly can galvanize the mega community. He also alienates many moderate and independent voters and galvanizes the other side as well. And it's very rare in a midterm election, generally speaking, since World War II, the party has lost 26 seats in the House of Representatives on average. Usually there's buyer's remorse on the part of the American people toward the president because they tend to overpromise and underperform. In this case, you do have a president whose job approval is under 40%, but you still have a scenario where it appears that the Democrats might actually have picked up a seat in the United States Senate, which is almost unprecedented. Well, it's close to unprecedented.
Well, picking up on Trump, let's talk about his neighbor, Ron DeSantis. He had a heck of a showing down in Florida. I mean, he won Dade County and that whole area, Miami, for what was it, like the first time in 40 years?
2002.
And we were talking about that the last show. What was that going to come down to? So now it wasn't, it was huge for DeSantis. What do you think happens now? I mean, we've got a lot of, I don't want to say dissension on the Trump part, just based on some of the things that have happened recently. But do you think this is really a door opener for Ron DeSantis in 24? I know we spoke about, I promised to remain your governor, but going back to Clinton in Arkansas, can't you see him coming forward and saying, I think the country needs me?
Yeah, the way Clinton did it, actually. So Clinton was in a debate with Sheffield Nelson, and the Republican nominee at the time, the poll was 44% Nelson, 44% Clinton. So they asked the question in a debate. They said, will you serve out your full term? And he essentially said, you bet. Then he goes through entire legislative session. It appears he's not going to run. George H.W. Bush's job approval goes from 90% to about 38%. Clinton sees an aperture there, and then he decides to go on a secret listening tour. He literally did this. He went around the state with one aide, and he would go to different events. He would go to grocery stores and he'd say, what do you think about the idea of me getting out of this promise? Basically, what he said is, you can only squeeze as much blood out of a turnip as governor, and I can do more for Arkansas as president than as governor. So he comes out and essentially declares he's going to run for president. That's how he did it. Pete Wilson in California, 1994, running for re-election, very close race. He said, I will not run in 1996. Then he comes up and he says, well, I can do more for California as governor than as president. Now, what DeSantis did is similar to what George W. Bush did. In 1998, George W. Bush had a 73% job approval rating, so he was well ahead. And he had one debate with Gary Moreau, the land commissioner, and they asked him essentially, would you serve out your full term? And basically he says, well, it's something I may consider running for president, but I'm not thinking about it now. In terms of Ron DeSantis, in the debate, if you saw, there was a one time where former Governor Charlie Crist, he wasn't supposed to ask questions. Mm-hmm. He asked a question. He said, I want to know if you'll serve out your full term. And Ron DeSantis was ready for it. He says, the only donkey I want to put out to pasture is Charlie Crist. Right. Now, what that shows, first of all, he never said decisively that he was not going, that he would serve out his full term, but also generally speaking, other than maybe Bob Dornan, who ran for Congress in 1996, running for re-election and lost by 984 votes after a failed presidential candidacy. It's very rare that voters actually take people up on that and get offended and say, I want you to serve my full term. Generally, it's a secondary, tertiary issue. So DeSantis essentially knows that. So he's going to be governor of Florida. And he knows that essentially the next 2 years, assuming he runs for president, the lieutenant governor is essentially going to take over for most of the state of Florida, specifically in 2024, if he does indeed run. But I think that he's going to use Florida and the fact that he has majorities in both houses of the legislature now in Florida during this legislative session. He's going to try to bolster or fortify, if you will, his bona fides within the conservative movement. And then after the legislative session, Bill Clinton did the same thing, by the way, in 1991. After his legislative session, then he's going to say, essentially, I'm thinking about running for president. And then he's going to use what he accomplished in Florida with conservatives. And he's going to say, essentially, I'm going to run for president. That's my guess right now. And whether he'll do it with Donald Trump in the race, he's only
right. And that's kind of the elephant in the room right now, isn't it? Because you've got Trump and, there's some heated stuff between, from what I've heard, the two of them, going back and forth. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure. But I mean, until that all gets settled out, I guess we won't know. But based on the showing that he had on Tuesday, I'd be surprised if he didn't have a choice, if people just made him run. Let's shift over to Pennsylvania. That was interesting. Kind of took me by surprise, to be quite honest with you. What was your take on that, Dr. Oz Fetterman? I mean, again, there's a lot of heated discussion going on about that one. Were you surprised?
Yeah, just one more thing about the last race.
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Thomas E. Dewey, running for re-election in 1946, got about 57%. Mm-hmm. He automatically, after that victory, running for re-election as governor of New York, used that to propel himself for the presidential run. And George W. Bush in 1998 won 68% of the vote in that gubernatorial race. He won 25% of African-American votes, 49% of Latinos, 60% of females. Mm-hmm. And he used that became the front runner on the Republican nomination and said, if I can do this well with these constituencies in Texas, this is how I can do it as a presidential candidate. So the fact that he won by such a large margin, he can now say, look what I've done to the state of Florida. He said, I won Miami-Dade County, the first governor to do that. Right. Jeb Bush in 2002, and they can say, this is a swing state. This is a state that Bill Clinton won in 1996, for example. You can say to Republican voters, if I can win Florida by almost 20 points, I can win the general election. Now,
he basically, wasn't it within the last 4 years, he's gone up 40 points or something? When you look at, from what I understand, if you total them all up, I mean, he had a heck of a giant leap. Just going back to the last time he ran. And I mean, it was just astronomical, wasn't it?
Yeah. And the amazing thing was, in his last election, he was not the establishment candidate in the Republican Party. Right. Agriculture Commissioner Adam Putnam was. Donald Trump, when he basically implies that kind of I made Ron DeSantis, well, that's kind of true. He was a relatively obscure congressperson. He was actually running for the Senate race when Marco Rubio was running for president in 2016 and said he would not run for the Senate. Ron DeSantis was essentially in that race. And then Marco Rubio comes back to Florida and says, I want to be a senator. So he drops out of that race, runs for governor 2 years later. And Donald Trump endorses DeSantis over Putnam. That does propel him to the nomination. And then he wins the general election literally by less than 1% of the vote. Now, the fact that he won by such a large, really almost elephantine margin over a relatively formidable candidate. I mean, this is a guy who was a former governor who had a job approval rating at one point of 70%, a former Republican governor. This isn't, some state representative that no one's ever heard of. Part of it is that Florida is changing itself. It's not necessarily a DeSantis wave. If you look at Marco Rubio, look at some of the congressional races, Florida is essentially going from a purple state, just like Ohio and Iowa, and they're becoming red states, where other states like Georgia and North Carolina are essentially becoming more and more purple, going from red. Arizona as well. So a lot of it's not necessarily him, but he's essentially going to use that. And that's going to be his main presidential. That's going to be one of his bona fides is, if I can do well in this state, and running for governor's re-election, look what I can do running for president. That's what he's thinking.
And especially with the whole Hispanic community. I mean, he got the backing again down at Miami-Dade, which is huge. And I think that could carry over. But once again, you've got Trump, and I don't make any bones about it. I like Trump. I think he did a great job. He came in at the right time, and we needed to have things shaken up a little bit, and he did that. And it got, he turned the economy around. I mean, but when it comes down to the whole unification factor of somebody that's going to actually unify the country, I mean, I got to be honest. I mean, I see DeSantis more of that, man. What do you think Trump sees that as well? And do you think, from an ego standpoint, he could step away, or do you think there's going to be a fight?
Well, I don't think there's really anybody that can truly unify the country right now. I think that we are very divided.
You and I, Rich, we can do it.
That we can unify. You know what would unify the country?
What's that?
Maybe not unify the country, but unify Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Retroactive pay raises.
Okay.
Pay raises for a member of Congress. That will get them to work together.
Now, when you say, well, wait a minute. So wait. Now, who's the comedian in the room here? Are you joking? Or am I joking? Okay.
Yeah. That will bring all of them together because they all want more money. So.
Sure it would. Yes. And then we'll all have a cocktail party over at Nancy's place. Okay, let's move on.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that's right. Pennsylvania. That really surprised me. That did surprise me. That it did surprise you, especially not so much just because of the personalities of the two, but you have, Fetterman coming out basically saying he's going to stop fracking, he's going to stop all this stuff. I mean, you're talking about destroying an industry. How does this guy get the backing of people who are basically saying this guy's going to put us out of a job?
Well, of course, he kind of hedges on that, but I'll leave that alone. But basically, you got to remember, Pennsylvania is essentially Philadelphia here, Pittsburgh here, right. A couple of college towns in between that vote Democrat, and the rest is essentially rock rib Republican. So that area, he knows he's not going to win. And I think he knows that he can do this. He could win essentially with Philadelphia, the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and a few college towns in between. And you know what? In that case, in that election, both political parties got nominated their weakest possible candidate. On the Republican side, Dr. Oz was certainly not the strongest candidate. On the Democratic side, Connor Lamb, a moderate veteran Democrat, who had blue collar appeal, was too moderate for the Democratic primary. He probably would have won by 5 or 6 points had he been the nominee. So both parties, it's all things being equal, ceteris paribus, you have your weakest possible candidates. So in terms of John Fetterman and Dr. Oz, essentially, I think it came down to a red-blue Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. And I don't think people cared necessarily about how John Fetterman appeared in the debate. A lot of them didn't necessarily care about Dr. Oz on his television program. It was just, we're at this point now, it's just liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. And that being the case, John Fetterman was able to win. But, it's interesting. In 2016, he supported Bernie Sanders, and Hillary Clinton that year absolutely eviscerated Bernie Sanders in the Pennsylvania primaries. This is not a state generally as a whole that appeals to the progressive bloodline of the Democratic Party, but it was really just right. It was really just right-left. It had nothing to do with the quality of the candidates.
All right, and that comes down to it. Do you think he's going to go along with that whole agenda? I mean, do they basically just want another blue person, a blue vote, I should say, in the Senate? You think he's going to just, I don't know, I'm not going to go there, but I think there's in some ways Biden does that. Do you think that Fetterman is just going to sit back and say, hey, whatever you guys want, I'll do it? Going into it, do you realize that was his role?
No, I don't think I don't. I think he saw himself as kind of an insurgent taking on the establishment. And that's always what he's been. He was lieutenant governor. He took on an incumbent when he's running for lieutenant governor. He's somebody that's always been an insurrectionist when he was in the Senate. And I think that, but no, I think his voting record will probably be very similar to the other Pennsylvania senator, Senator Casey. It'll basically be down the line Democrat, but he'll show some independence on Pennsylvania issues. Because remember, when he runs assuming he runs for re-election in 6 years, he needs to be able to point to specific votes to say, this is where I was independent from my party. And I think he certainly will have some of those. I think one thing he might try, one thing in terms of Pennsylvania that could be a flagship issue for him is kind of the anti-globalism that certainly Bernie Sanders stands for, and certainly being against many trade agreements. That's something that certainly I think many voters in specifically central Pennsylvania blame trade as opposed to automation and other things for the hemorrhaging of their jobs. And that's where the populist message, I think, can strike a resonant chord, so it might surprise some people in terms of being able to make some inroads in that area of Pennsylvania.
Well, going off even the voting part of things, I'm just going to cut to the chase. A lot of the stuff, if you look at how he performed in that debate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously got to be an issue. I mean, as far as, is he mentally fit to actually serve this office? And people will say, well, FDR, he was in a wheelchair. Yeah, but this is kind of different. I mean, if he is fit, I mean, if he can do it and he's having a communication problem, I understand that. But how do we do things here in this stage of the game that we're in? I mean, is he really able to serve, do you think?
Yeah, Carol Munt had a stroke in 1969, served till the end of his term. No one said a thing. The thing with the United States Senate is it's essentially, other than showing up for votes, you don't really have to show up for votes. A lot of the votes are essentially minor pieces of legislation, naming post offices. You have to show up for votes that actually matter. But look at when people run for president. I mean, Barack Obama,
Sure.
John McCain, especially spent 2 years running for president, only showing up when they actually had to, not doing town hall meetings. Look at Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz gets elected to the Senate in 2012. 2 years later, he's off running for president. So what does that prove? It proves essentially that the United States Senate is one of the few jobs, by the way, where you can get a job, get elected to a job, then immediately start running for another job. And you're going to see this. I mean, you're going to see this certainly in Florida after the legislative session if DeSantis runs for president. So basically, United States Senator's job is what you put into it, but you can spend an inordinate amount of time doing something other than showing up. People used to give paid speeches when they were United States Senators, and they're only in session for a short period of time. So essentially, after that, they're supposed to be doing constituent service, but they're really running around the country campaigning for other people. So you can essentially have an absentee senator, and they have a staff if you need something. If you need a Social Security check that's not coming in or something, you call the staff. But a senator can basically be absentee.
Gotcha. So you're basically saying our representatives don't do a hell of a whole lot.
Well, they can't. No, I think the ones that do a lot.
Oh no. I was
kind never hear about. The ones that are on like the Appropriations Committee are not the ones that want to run for president because you can't use that to get bona fides for running for president. But some there. I mean, there's no question that when Barack Obama got elected to the Senate, when Ted Cruz got elected to the Senate, immediately it was, how do I run for president?
Sure.
So that's their objective. Now you have others like, Ted Stevens from Alaska, Bob Byrd, that were in there for 40, 50 years, Strom Thurmond. They actually brought stuff into their states and became spoilsmen. Thad Cochran from Mississippi, for example, they actually did a lot for their states, but you never heard of him because he was never, on television. He never had any real presidential aspirations, for example. Even Patty Murray from Washington, you very rarely hear about her, but she is able to bring stuff back to her state, and whereas others just essentially use it as a platform to get to run for president.
Okay. Well, again, it kind of surprised me, but let's move down south. What about Texas? Beto O'Rourke didn't do too well. Abbott showed up to play. Did that surprise you at all as far as the numbers go?
The numbers did, yes. I thought Greg Abbott would win, but I thought that Beto O'Rourke was a more formidable candidate than that. Texas has not elected a governor since Ann Richards in 1990, and the only reason she won was because her opponent, Clayton Williams, had a lot of faux pas, toward the end of the race. He said some very negative things about Hispanics and about rape, and he was way ahead and ended up losing. And then George W. Bush beat her in 1994. But what this shows is Texas is not as in play, I think, at the other state or the federal level as Democrats thought it would. Last time around, you had Biden, you had Harris campaigning there, thinking that they actually had a chance because of the growing demographics of suburban, middle-class suburban voters in Houston, certainly places like Houston proper, Dallas, certainly Austin, very liberal. They thought they could win in the cities like Laredo, and they did do actually relatively well in the border. And if you look at some of the Democrats who got reelected, Henry Cuellar, for example, represents a border district. So that's the only place essentially that they really did well in that. But it is showing that Texas is not the swing state that I think a lot of Democrats thought they were going to make it. So my guess is in 2024, barring polls showing that they're going to do very well, which I think are probably not going to happen. They're going to spend very little money in Texas. Beto O'Rourke is interesting because he's somebody that really came out of nowhere. He was a 2-term congressman in 2018. He captured the mind of Texas voters because he went everywhere. He went to Midland, he went to Odessa, he went to the most conservative parts of the Texas. And he was able to actually appeal to voters in places like that. So I think a lot of Democrats were saying, well, if this guy wins, this guy's going to be a presidential candidate somewhere. This is a guy who can appeal all over the state of Texas. So he loses, but he does formidable. Then he runs for president, gets nowhere. Then he runs for governor, gets nowhere. So I don't know what he's going to do next. Run for Secretary of State? I don't know, but I think he's probably done.
Well, yeah, and I'm not a big fan anyway. But you also hit on.
Yeah, he speaks well of you.
Oh, he does. Well, I know he did, but he pronounced my last name wrong, and you know how that irks me. Anyway, going back, you hit on something just a second ago, and you mentioned the polls. I Are the polls even reliable? I mean, the thing is, I think one of the big fallacies about this red wave were all these polls. And part of me is like, was that part of the reason? Do people just not show up as much as they could have in certain areas? But the polls just don't seem accurate. How can you even trust the polls anymore?
I think most of the polls, actually, the gubernatorial races were generally accurate in Georgia. They basically predicted how Brian Kemp would do the Senate race. The basic prediction was it was going to be essentially a tie. It essentially was. State like Florida, no one saw that coming. No one thought that people thought he was going to win by, it was more like going to be 6 or 7 points. The fact that he won by as many votes, that Governor DeSantis won by as many votes as he did, I think that really shocked a lot of people. But the last election, the presidential election, most people point to as polls being mendacious was 2016. They say, well, Hillary Clinton, the polls all showed he was going to win. Well, actually, the polls showed that she was going to win by 3 percentage points. She won by 2.1 percentage points in the popular vote. What they didn't count on was the Electoral College, and what they didn't count on was specific parts of states like Erie County, Pennsylvania, that Donald Trump was able to essentially win places and do very well, run up the score in some of these places that were traditionally Democrat. But generally speaking, I think most of these polls that we saw are generally accurate. And most of what we saw, by the way, too, a lot of races we think are going to be blowouts, the Maryland governor's race, the Massachusetts governor's race, pretty much were blowouts.
Okay, well, we're almost at my favorite part of the program, which are your surprises. Minnesota, that surprised me that she was able to hang on. What are your big surprises?
Big surprises. Well, I don't know if it's really necessarily a surprise, but I think that I always bring up the district of Northern Maine. Jared Golden, once again, one of the few survivors in a Democratic district. He actually had a moderate Republican, not a MAGA Republican, running against him. This is a district that went about 55% for Trump. It was the most Republican district, at least supporting Trump, that had a Democrat. He had a different message from the rest of the party. He was the only Democrat to vote against COVID relief, to vote against background checks for guns. He was probably the most conservative Democrat, and he showed that he was still able to win with that different message by appealing to conservative voters in Prescott, Maine. So he's kind of a throwback, I guess. Mm-hmm. Certainly the Colorado race. Lori Boebert, I think it was kind of a little bit on people's radar that this was going to be a close election, but very few people thought she was actually going to lose. This is the western. It's Aspen, but this is the western slope of Colorado. This is Grand Junction. Mm-hmm. This is some of the most conservative parts of not only Colorado, but I think some of the most conservative parts of the country. Another one would be Elise Slotkin in Michigan. She's now she represents a district she's the only Democrat that represents a district that went for Republicans in 2012, 2016, and 2020 in the presidential election. And part of the reason she won, I think, is because the Republicans nominated someone that was just very much too conservative for that state. You look around, I think Rhode Island, I think the Republicans thought they had a chance at the governor's race. They didn't come close. I think they thought they had a chance. There was a kind of a weird aberrant congressional race. And Alan Fung, the former mayor of Cranston, was running for that seat. And many Republicans thought that this was kind of the hope of taking off the Democratic seat. But Seth Magaziner essentially landed up winning there. Congresswoman Spanberger, many Republicans did everything they possibly could to siphon her off. She landed up winning. So those are kind of, I think, generally the surprises. But and Laura Kelly in Kansas, mm-hmm. Laura Kelly, the governor of Kansas, represents a state that went 15 points last time around for Donald Trump. She's somehow able to survive, and she got reelected, and she got reelected as a Democrat in Kansas. So she's somebody that I think Democrats certainly will be looking at her playbook, and she's a potential vice presidential candidate maybe down the road just because she shows her electoral bona fides in the state of Kansas, which is not exactly, a liberal bastion.
Gotcha. Okay, well, we're down to our last minute here, Rich. What are you thinking about for Georgia? Just your gut feeling. What do we got?
I have no idea. My guess is, though, my bet would be that Raphael Warnock probably wins in Georgia. Mm-hmm. I think that Herschel Walker, Herschel Walker simply without Chase Oliver, the Libertarian in the race. My guess is Raphael Warnock probably wins by a few points. I think Democrats are certainly going to pour money into the state of Georgia, and I think that Herschel Walker is going to be seen as too alligated or tethered or connected to Donald Trump. So that's my guess.
Wow. Lots to think about. And it's not over. I guess we'll talk again about the recaps here in a month or so, if not before, right?
Oh, and interestingly, Guam elected the first. They have a non-voting delegate. This is something the Republicans can hold, because Republicans have been very happy about the first Republican delegate elected to Guam since 1993.
Well, wow. Okay. I didn't know that. And that leads me back to my final thought. It's almost holiday season. Actually, it pretty much is, if you listen to the radio. You got your book out. Okay. You got a lot of stuff in there. How's the book going? And how can people get a hold of it so that they can order copies for their friends, neighbors, relatives, whatever? How can they get a hold of it, Rick?
Yeah. Just Google the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids by Rich Rubino, or just Google Rich Rubino, or find me on Facebook, and it's $20 of 512 pages of political trivia.
It's an amazing book. I mean, the thing is, it's so big. It's probably the biggest book. I haven't picked up a book that big since college textbooks, and I didn't really pick one up then. So I really couldn't imagine anything bigger than this book, but it is a great book. I recommend that everybody go out and get it on Amazon. Well, thank you very much again for joining me. Again, this isn't really what I expected, that we would still have possibly another recap here coming up in a few weeks, but I'll look forward to that. And any final words before we cut out?
No, just that, this is basically, I think the general lesson of this election is that, you have a scenario, very rare, where you have a president whose job approval rating is under 50%, but there was not a dramatic red wave. So obviously the Republicans are going to do an autopsy, and they're going to try to figure out why it is that this was not a red wave. But I'll say one part of this, there were just very few marginal districts. In 2018, a lot of moderate Democrats were elected. Then they lost their reelection in 2020. So part of it is just there is not that many marginal districts left. In 2020, only 16 members of the House of Representatives were elected in a congressional district that elected a different person for president from a different party. So if Donald Trump gets elected, they also elect a Democrat. So we're just at this era right now where parties are so ideologically homogenous. And it didn't used to be this way. It used to be there were conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. Now there's liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans, and a few kind of here in the center. But that's, I think, part of what's going on. So a lot of it doesn't necessarily have to do with Biden or Trump or anybody else, Rutherford B. Hayes or anybody else. It's just the way the division is now between the parties, not internal to the parties.
Right. So basically whose team you're on. Well, thanks a lot for joining me, Rich. We'll talk to you, I guess, in a few weeks. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Todd.
Okay. And I'd also, as always, I would like to thank you for joining me, whether you've been listening or watching. I'm Todd Schowalter, and this is Right Mind. And remember, if you don't have a right mind, you don't have a mind at all. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This has been the Right Mind Podcast with Todd Schowalter.